everybody. Welcome back to Catholicism with Colin. Today we have our first guest on, Bryan from Quest for Faith with Bryan on YouTube. You can find his link in the description. So today we're going to be talking about, he's going to be telling me about his conversion experience and how he came to be Catholic and, how his life has been since. So thanks for coming on, Bryan.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I was glad you reached out to me. So,
Awesome. So what was your life like before you became a Christian?
um, it was. I've always grown up in a family of faith. So I grew up in the Church of Christ, which is a fundamentalist group for the better or worse. And
Right.
so I grew up going to church 3 times a week: Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night.
Right.
So there wasn't really a period of time where God wasn't a part of my life.
Right.
Now, I will say that since becoming Catholic, I definitely have grown in my faith a ton. But
Right.
prior to, I think it's always been a constant in my life, which is a blessing because I know
That's
tons
great.
of people
Yeah.
that haven't had that. So.
Right. Yeah, no, that's great. So, like you said you were in like a fundamentalist sect, you like the Church of Christ, right? Like
Yeah.
when we're talking fundamentalists, we're talking like out in the river in the middle of America doing baptisms there, not that
No,
crazy.
no, no.
Yeah.
So, Church of Christ, they started in the 1830s with
Okay.
the Campbell movement out of Kentucky, and
Okay.
the whole purpose. Most of them came from a Presbyterian, I think.
Okay.
But there's a lot of different churches that started in this movement in
Yeah.
the 1930s, and
Right.
their basic theology was we're going to throw everything out
Yeah.
and we're going to solely use the Bible to create our beliefs. And
Right.
so even with Church of Christ, one of the distinctive factors with them is they don't use instruments in worship because there's no example of it being used in the New Testament
Right.
of instruments in worship. And
Hmm.
so all their services are a cappella. And so that's definitely a distinguishing factor. They do have communion every Sunday, and communion's a
Right.
big deal, and you can't take communion until you've been baptized.
Okay.
And they do have a salvation works type. It's really close to Catholicism, where like you can't earn your salvation, but you can lose
Right.
it type deal. So
Yeah. Okay.
it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of theological things that they're so close on, but kind of
Right.
miss
Yeah.
it. So.
Right. It sounds like it's definitely different than some other Protestants where it's like, yeah, like, like, because a lot of Protestants believe that, it's like faith, but not works is what saves us, which is true. But, you need works to keep your faith alive. Like, if you don't have works in your life, then what is your faith? It's just an
Yep.
idea in your head. Like, yeah, you need to live the Christian life. I mean, that's what every Christian does. Like, if you want to be a good Christian, you have to live the way that Christ taught. Um,
Exactly, exactly. And your works reflect your faith,
yeah.
so yeah.
Well,
But,
yeah, it's
but
great to evangelize too. Just like,
yep,
showing your that.
yeah, for sure. So yeah, that's kind of a quick synopsis. It's way more complicated than that. They
Yeah,
do believe that they don't believe that they're a denomination. They
right.
believe that they're just like the first century church.
Like we actually are. So they think that they're.
They don't look at church history.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Oh. Okay.
that's a whole other thing. And
Yeah.
and I did a video on like books to read. And one of the
Yeah.
first things I did when I started questioning things, and we can get into that later, was a history book that's used as a textbook at my alma mater. I went to Abilene Christian University, which is a Church of Christ college.
Right.
And it was just awful because there's zero references to anything they're saying in there. So even when they're
Yeah.
denying Peter as the first pope, it's like, well, Peter was probably there in Rome, but at the same time Paul was, so we don't
Right.
know. And I'm like, well, where's your source to say that? Anyways, so I'll stop there. But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely a lot of holes in that theology right there. Yeah.
yeah,
So all right. So at this point, like, right, you're in like this, Protestant Christian. family and everything. You've got like a strong faith, which is better to say than like a lot of people. Like I was never raised in any sort of faith or anything like that. So how did you like? What was like the point like in your life where you like really realized like, whoa, like Christ, the Bible, like all of this is like this is everything.
Um, I think the big turning point for me, faith-wise, was probably after I got married.
Okay.
I think not that I didn't take it seriously, not that I wasn't going to church regularly, but I think I started really feeling like I needed to spend more time on it. And we can kind of like, there was definitely a falling away at that point, but that yearning to want to know more and to discuss Christ with other people and salvation and all that stuff really kind of started after I got married.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say then. There's not really a catalyst, I would say, that made that come. There wasn't like a life event. It
Yeah.
just started, I don't know, maybe just getting married, being more mature.
Right.
I stopped partying and all that stuff once you get married. Kind of no point to go to the bars anymore.
Yeah.
It was probably a catalyst of just growing older. So,
Right. Well, there's a friend of mine who I know who he's an adult man. He's married. He has 4 kids now, and you know he he was like always partying when he was younger and everything, always getting drunk every weekend. And one weekend he was like, I'm just not going to drink everything. I'm going to stay sober the whole weekend. And when he was looking around, he just saw death and despair and just like people ruining their lives and ruining your relationship with others. Like, that kind of opened his eyes and he became, Catholic again.
yeah, I think when you're young, you're just trying to have fun. You're not
Right.
thinking of anything past the moment.
Right.
And I think it's real easy to fall into that, to fall into that. And I mean, I'll say like some of my worst life choices were definitely while I was drunk. So
Right.
definitely, kids, don't go get drunk. I'll say
Right.
that.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, like so you were like married and that's when you realized you're like, okay, time to get serious. Jesus, this is everything. So how did you like first commit your life to the Lord? So like you're at the point like when you're first married and everything, you realize Jesus is everything. This is very important. Like how did you kind of start that? Like, how'd you commit?
Well, I'll kind of back up a little bit because
Okay.
I think that's when I started taking it more serious. Because it's a walk, right? It's a walk of faith, and so
Yeah.
you have your ups and downs.
Yes.
Um, and just to kind of, I'm not going to dive way too deep into everything, but I knew I wanted to be baptized, be a Christian when I was like 12, right?
Yeah.
And Church of Christ is one of those that you have to make they don't do infant baptism. You have to make the choice to be baptized.
Okay.
And I remember, I think I asked my mom when I was 12, like, or 11 or 12, like, I want to get baptized. And she was like, well, it's a lifelong commitment. And she kind of pushed back and like, I want you to think about it. And it made me mad. So I was like, forget it. I'm not doing it. But then in high school, I eventually got baptized, I think, when I was 17. But during that period of time, like I was involved in Young Life and I was one of the only out of my group of friends, myself and one other kid were really the only practicing Christians, I guess you could say,
Right.
right? And so it was always like they were always asking me biblical questions, especially once we all started getting really involved in Young Life,
Yeah.
and so that kind of continued. And I was a Young Life leader my freshman year of college, and then when I stopped doing that, and I went away to school. It was pretty much partying for three,
Right.
4 years, and then getting out. But so I kind of went through that dip, right? So like it was important to me, but I was still kind of in that, I don't know, young and dumb thing, right? And so, but then when I got married, it's like, man, okay, I'm married, and I'm realizing as an adult, I'm seeing people that are struggling with their faith, and we kind of started a prayer group at work.
Right.
And so every morning somebody would volunteer to type out a prayer for everybody to read. And they'd send it out on this email. And so then I started leading Bible studies at work and for during lunch breaks and stuff. And so that's kind of where I started owning it more, right?
Right.
And yeah, so it started being more of a everyday thing for me, and not just like, oh well, yeah, I'm a Christian, but tonight I'm gonna go get drunk, right? Like it was not, that mindset was gone. Now it was more centered around that. Now I had struggles after that, but yeah, so that's kind of, I think, the point. Like
Right.
if you go through that ebb and flow, so
Yeah, it's kind of like where it's like, okay, time to get serious. No more full. Yeah.
yeah.
Awesome. So, like, you know, after like you kind of realized that like Jesus is like everything. Like you said, like it was in like your 30s. That was kind of when you realized like that. How did you like?
Probably 20s,
How,
but yeah.
okay, yeah. Like so, like around that time, how did you, how did you, change your life? Like, how was your life changed by that?
I think it started, it really was, maybe it was just having kids too.
Right.
But church started becoming really important to me. And I started, instead of having work friends where I'd go out and hang out and go to the bars with them,
Mm-hmm.
church friends started being a lot more important. I wanted to surround myself with other Christians.
Right.
And so I think that was key. I think my language started improving.
Good.
You,
Yeah.
you can ask my wife, and I talk like a sailor.
Right.
Uh, so I was no example of of being righteous at all,
Yeah.
even in my language use. But I think that those are just the little changes that started, because my emphasis started being on becoming building a community around my faith versus building a community around my work life and drinking. So I think
Right.
that was probably the big change.
Yeah. See, that's actually really important though, because like who we surround ourselves with. I'm sure you might have heard the like the quote that we're like the five people we spend the most time with, which is certainly true. Like no person's an island. We all
Yep.
absorb traits in those we spend our time with, and I found myself doing the same things. Like it's not that I don't still have some of those secular friends from school or whatever else, but I do like to like give a lot of time with like young adult groups and youth groups and all sorts of things like that. Just spending time with people who are like deep into their faith and growing together as Christians, and that's really good for keeping up your faith.
Yeah, it is. And that's definitely, I look at society today and I hear these stories of parents. So I'll be 42 this next week, so I'm an old dude.
Happy birthday. Yeah.
And thank you. But I'll hear these stories of these parents that when their kids, get out of the house and graduate college or whatever, and they
Right.
just completely fall away from the faith.
Yeah.
And it's like some of these kids that I know them, right? I know it's because of the people they've associated with. And so I really do think it is very important, like who you choose. And that whole statement of your close, I think it's, you're the average of the five closest friends that you hang out with.
Yeah.
That's true. Like
Yeah.
the people you choose to spend your time with are the people you're going to be reflecting. And
Right.
so I do think that's important. And I think it's important to align yourself with people of faith and people that have drive too, and want to improve themselves. So
Yeah, because like I had a friend who I met in youth ministry, and me and him have just been like becoming better and better friends, and I can see like our faith is actually becoming stronger. Like now he's evangelizing on the bus on the ride home, and
that's awesome.
like we've been yeah. So and that's great though, because then like spirit, like the Holy Spirit can work through us, but also friendship helps with that, and that's great. So
Yeah.
um yeah. So how did you realize you needed to become Catholic?
So, all right. So I had, in my late 20s, I had been laid off. This was 2008, 2009. And so
Okay.
this leads up to this. This is kind of like the steps that got me there.
Right.
we're talking the mortgage collapse, and I'm in the financial industry. So that mortgage collapse in '08 cost me 2 jobs. I basically got laid off twice because of that, and I decided to go back to school, and I went back to Abilene Christian University. And during that period of time is when I realized, like, I don't want to go to Church of Christ anymore, but I don't know where to go. Like, I'm just lost. And then we kept trying to find churches, and we couldn't the whole time we were in Abilene. And then we moved back to Dallas, and we had a really rough year. And this is like 2012. And I was basically like, I am done. I don't want to go to church anymore. I can't. And, but the Lord just kept calling me. Like, I couldn't say no. Like, I still wanted to go. I could tell, I could feel it in my heart. And so then we started church shopping around, which was awful. I hate that. I hate it. The Protestant church shop. It's awful. Right. Yeah. And we landed at a Methodist church, and my wife grew up Methodist. And, it wasn't, for me, it was a Band-Aid, right? It was like, we were compromising on both. Like, I was just trying to go through the motions faith-wise at this point. Like, I had really just kind of almost fallen away, but I knew I shouldn't, and I can't. And so fast forward like 5-6 years, and the Methodist Church currently is literally splitting over this issue right now. But about gay marriage and ordinating LGBTQ individuals as priests or preachers. But at the time, I knew this issue was coming, and this was 2018, I want to say now.
Yeah.
And I had a feeling where our church was going to land, because we were kind of a progressive church, and they had this conference in 2018 when all the leaders of the Methodist Church got together, and they voted against it, which I was like, oh wow, this is great. We did the right thing. Well, then our preacher stands up the next Sunday and says how he's really disappointed in the way that the church voted on this, and he's going to lead a Bible study to show how gay marriage is biblical. And that was the last time I went to church there. And so what ended up happening was, like 4 years before this or so, I found out about growing up Church of Christ. The Bible's everything, right? I mean, that's faith, sola scriptura, everything's out of the Bible. Well, I had found out that the Apocrypha hadn't been removed until the 1800s from Protestant Bibles. And I was like, that's not that long ago. That doesn't sit well with me. Like, what actually happened? So now it was like, well, I'm not going to church on Sundays because I don't know where I'm going to go. And every church in our area is on board with gay marriage and all that stuff. And I'm like, I don't know where to go. And so I was like, I need to go and research this. And so I started researching it, found out the reason it was the Apocrypha was removed was really for money. It was cheaper to print the Bibles without those 7 books. Like, they were still segregating them to the Apocrypha, as in these are good to read, but you don't really necessarily have to use them for dogmatic purposes or you know, but they're still good to read. Well, in the 1800s, they started this movement to print them without, because it was cheaper. And
I've heard something else. I've heard that Martin Luther believed that they weren't actually a part of the Old Testament because he thought that they were like because the Jews didn't consider them to be.
Yeah, I'll get to that. So I find this whole thing out, and I'm like, all right, now I have to look at Martin Luther. And so then I started reading all of Martin Luther's stuff and realizing his objections, right? And some of his objections were that, well, the Jews here in Germany, these books aren't in their Bibles. That was one of his objections. Also, he was starting to say he didn't believe in purgatory, and so, well, then I don't think that Second Maccabees is scriptural, because in Second Maccabees it talks about praying for the dead. And so he starts having these debates and arguments, and in his Bible, like it's how he set it up. It was the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, and it said a note in there like these aren't at the same level of the Old Testament canon, but they're still good to read. And then he'd have the New Testament. And then he even, with James, Revelations, and one other book, I can't remember, he would put he wouldn't number them as part of the New Testament, but it'd be in his Bible, but he wouldn't really say anything about it because he didn't like James because it says faith alone, you need works. You can't just live by faith alone. But anyways, so then it was like, okay, well, if the Jews didn't, but when did the Jewish canon get finalized? When did they say, okay, here's our Bible? And so when I started looking into that, I found out, that was in like the 200s and 300s. So that was after Christ.
Right.
No, I'm sorry, that doesn't hold water. Like if their canon had been finished before Christ, and it was the same canon they were using, at 100 BC as they're using in 1500. Okay, you got an argument there, but they hadn't completed their canon until right before we put our canon together. So you can't you can't use that anymore. So so that freaked me out, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't think these books should have been removed at all now. And so then it was like, okay, I need to look into the first century church because and I don't want to look at anything past like 200 because as a Protestant growing up, it was kind of like around the 300s is when the Catholic Church took over and everything was wrong after that. And so I started looking early, like I wanted everything from the first, and that actually you can see it in my picture, that church history. That's that textbook over there. From my alma mater, which is awful, so don't buy it. It has no references or anything, but it at least had names of the church fathers that I could then go and research on my own. Right. And so I found writings from Ignatius of Antioch, Saint Ignatius of Antioch, and I'm hoping that I'm gonna find the Church of Christ, right? That I grew up with in what they're reading, and I'm finding Catholic. Just everything Catholic. Yeah,
Catholic, yeah.
Yeah, and when I get to St. Ignatius of Antioch, he has in one of his 7 letters on his way to Rome to be executed for the Eucharist. I'm going to paraphrase this, but he basically says, if you don't believe that it's the body and blood of Jesus Christ in the Holy Eucharist, you're not a Christian.
Wow.
And I'm like, what? And at the same time this is going on, my wife is doing a Bible study on John 6 for Lent. So this is like all happening at the same time. And she had just ran into to the end of John 6 in the Bread of Life dissertation and was like, it was crazy. This all happened like the same month. And then she comes to me with this, and I come to her with the research I did, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like what the heck is this? And so learning about John 6 and properly reading it correctly, I'm like, the Catholic and Orthodox are right. Like, what are we going to do? Like, that's where we need to go, I think. Right. And me growing up staunch anti-Catholic, this was freaking me out. Yeah, I'll stop there. But yeah, that was kind of the big catalyst that led me to the Catholic Church.
Right. So how did you make the choice between Catholic and Orthodox?
So then I started down the rabbit hole of authority, right? Because that's the big difference between the Orthodox and the Catholics is the Pope. Right. And so when I started looking into that, it's just really clear when you start looking at the entirety of the Bible, even Old Testament to New Testament, that Peter was the first pope. Yeah. And what I ended up finding and shocked me was that, so it's Matthew 16:18, I think, is the verse where he says, Peter, you're the rock that I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome. Whatever you bind on earth will be or whatever you bound on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven.
Right.
That, and I'll with the keys of the kingdom, right? And so that verse is almost identical to Isaiah 22:22, where it's talking about the chief steward being fired from the kingdom of Israel, and they're appointing a new chief steward and saying, here's the keys to the kingdom of Israel. Whatever you bound, it's the same language. Right. And so then then I'm like, wow, that is too crazily similar. What is this meaning? And you start realizing that the kingdom of God is kind of a map or a replica of the kingdom of Israel, where you have the 12 apostles, which are the representatives of just like the 12 tribes of Israel, you'd have a representative from them. Then out of those, you'd have a chief steward, which would hold the keys to the kingdom, that would run the kingdom while the king was away. And then you have Mary, the queen of heaven. You would the king's wife would not be the queen; it would be the king's mother would be the queen.
Yeah.
And so you have this entire just perfect map of Old Testament and New Testament, and that Christ is setting up a kingdom. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I have to become Catholic. This stinks. Yeah. Like, I was not happy.
Awesome. So we were at, you knew you needed to become Catholic.
Yes, and I was not happy about it. So,
you weren't? Okay.
No, I wasn't. Like, I grew up anti-Catholic. Like,
yeah.
My first memory of anything Catholic as a kid, I was 4 or 5. I was young. Like, I know I was at least younger than second grade. So I could have been 7, right? But I was watching Notre Dame football on Saturday morning, and my grandparents were visiting, and I said something like, I want to play for Notre Dame when I grow up.
Yeah. And
then my Nana in the background goes, you can't play for them. They're Catholic.
Right.
And I'm 5. I don't know what Catholic is, but that's like, it's crazy that memory stuck in my head, right? Like, I'm 42 and I still totally remember that memory. And so that's just kind of where I grew up. So this idea of, oh my gosh, the Catholic Church has been right this whole time. I have to go. Yeah. And what I was terrified of was that I was going to hate the Mass. And I had been to one or two, I went to a Catholic wedding Mass, which I didn't realize it was a Mass. Like, I was like, okay, this is how Catholics do their weddings. Like, I was ignorant.
Right.
And one of my great aunts was Catholic, and she had a Catholic funeral. So those are the only 2 times that I've been to a Catholic Mass. But a few years prior, this is when I was struggling, right? When I was like, I don't want to go to church anymore. My wife wanted to go for Ash Wednesday. She wanted to go to a church to do for the service, because Methodists do the Ash Wednesday thing too.
Yes.
Or at least the traditional Methodists did. And so we went to this Anglican church, which is very Catholic-like, right?
Right, yeah.
And I can't explain it any other way than it had to have been Satan. But I had this visceral, physical reaction to being in that service, to where I was like angry, mad, like I wanted to run out. I stayed, but it was just really weird. And I was like, oh my gosh, what if I have that same experience again when I go to Mass for the first time? And so I was in an absolute panic that was going to happen again.
Right.
So, I mean, obviously it didn't. And I went to Mass, and I was just and it was in Nova Soto. And it's so funny to me with this argument between my parish does both. We have a traditional Latin Mass and a Novus Ordo. But for a Protestant, the Novus Ordo feels like a Latin Mass. It's like, wow, this is so peaceful. And it's like, and and it was amazing. And we went to a Saturday mass. Like I wasn't gonna go Sunday. I was like, no, let's just check it out on Saturday. Maybe there'll be less people. I'll sit in the really back, you know. So yeah, and it was amazing. So
Yeah. No, I mean, it certainly, and, same for me. I mean, my parish is only Novus Ordo. I've been to, I've been to ordinary masses, which are like ones that are like Latin masses, but not entirely in Latin. But yeah, but yeah, like I go primarily to Novus Ordo.
Same.
And really, it's kind of wild to me. There's people on the internet, they're always yelling, like, oh, Novus Ordo, so irreverent and everything. I'm like, I see some of the most prayerful, holy people who I know, and they go to Novus Ordo masses. Like,
I think the problem I see with the Novus Ordo is that it can be, there's so many options within it that there really can be some very non-reverent Novus Ordo masses, and there are those out there. Like you see those crazy ones where people doing dances and like just it's like, man, are we at a what's Pentecostal Catholic church? Like what the heck? So I think that's where they're seeing the worst of it. But like my parish, like we sing the Gloria in Latin on the Novus Ordo. We do a number of songs and prayers in Latin during the Novus Ordo Mass. And our priest even actually face towards the tabernacle the whole time too. Oh wow. So it's a Novus Ordo, but they run it as if it's a Latin Mass. So they don't face you at all. So
wow, okay, yeah, that's very, I've never heard of that for a Novus Ordo, It's
they go as close as you can to traditional, but still be Novus Ordo, so.
Wow, yeah, so what was it like, so you joined RCIA, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, what was that, what was your experience in that like?
RCIA was great. For me, it wasn't, I think, okay, I'd already answered a lot, like, I'm a research guy, so I had most of the things down where I felt like I could give most of the talks at that point. Yeah. But I mean, it was great because I got to meet really great Catholics, and I got to build relationships in community. But I think it was overall a really good experience for me. And we had a class of 20, 30 people.
Wow.
At the time we were going, the parish I go to now is big, but I've moved to South Carolina since then. But our parish there was like 2,500, 3,000 people. Wow. So it was a very big parish in Dallas, but or in Athens, Texas, or not Allen, Texas. But it was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I love the fact that if you were somebody who was discerning and you weren't sure, you could go through the whole thing and still say, no, I don't want to do it. But then you at least get the information from the Catholic Church. You don't get the information from so-and-so Joe Schmo online who thinks Catholics are Satanists. So,
the Pope, Antichrist, all that kind of stuff.
So, I think RCI was great. It was really good for both my wife and I.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So, did you have to be baptized again?
No.
No. Okay.
So one of the things that the Catholic Church teaches, as long as you are baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, you're good. Yeah. So if you went to a different, they don't accept like Mormon baptisms.
No. Or
Jehovah's Witness, they don't accept.
Do they do Baptists? Because do they believe in the Trinity?
Baptists do believe in the Trinity, and I'm not sure they're. I think they do baptize in the name. Some denominations baptize in the name of Christ, because there's that one verse that says that, but it's not Jesus saying it. It's like I don't know. I can't remember what verse that is. So there is a verse that just says baptize them in the name of Christ. And so there is some denominations that do that. And so I'm not sure if those would work, if they'd have to be baptized again. But no, like my baptism was accepted, and so was my wife's, because she was baptized Methodist.
Yeah.
And so was my youngest son. But my oldest son, who's your age,
Yeah.
he hadn't been baptized yet because I was Church of Christ when he was little,
Right.
and we didn't do infant baptism, so he had to be baptized. But
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah, that's awesome. So, what was it like first confession? What was that like?
awful,
Awful.
awful.
You don't need
You're
to go like
talking
into
40
yep.
years of sins and
Right. Yeah.
atrocious drunken debauchery, college. I know. Yeah, you start thinking about like, man, all of these awful things that I have done, and as a Protestant, you can kind of just wave them off because you don't believe in mortal sins. So it's like, yeah, it's a sin. Christ, please forgive me of my sins. Just do a prayer. You're good.
Right.
But realizing the gravity of the sins that I had committed, that I didn't have assurance of whether I was forgiven or not on those. I'm a rip the Band-Aid off kind of guy. And so you have the option in most parishes to, either kneel behind a veil or a screen,
Yeah.
or do it face to face. And I was like, I have to do this face to face. Like
That's what
I
I
just
do. Yeah.
need to. And
Right.
so for my first confession, I did it face to face. And I think the priest was kind of shocked when I sat down because nobody really, like if you have the option, most people don't.
Most people don't. Yeah, I do the same thing, and they always look like startled, of like, oh, he's sitting here. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, it's, it was nerve wracking. I'll say that much. So,
Yeah.
I mean, to just start, I just kind of quickly, I summarized my sins, right? Like categorized them.
Yeah.
Versus naming every single time I did something awful. It was like, I did this a bunch. I did this a bunch, So, but
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. So, what was it like walking out of that confessional?
it felt great. Like I felt like a
Yeah.
weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and it's kind of this
Yeah.
odd feeling I wasn't expecting to feel, I would say.
Right.
But it was great. I love confession. After we're done here, I'm actually going to confession. So,
Awesome.
but yeah, it was good.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, all right, next up, no, at least it was for me. It was since I was already had been baptized in the Trinity. For me, it was confession, Eucharist, confirmation. So, what was your first Eucharist like? What was that like?
Surreal, like I don't know. It was like I still get that way when I'm in mass and they're consecrating the host, and I'm like, look what's happening. It's
Yeah,
Christ. Like they're turning it into
yeah,
Christ right there. This is amazing. And so, yeah, I mean, I think how blessed are we? Like we actually get to consume Christ through the
right.
Eucharist every time we go to mass. And the fact that we can do that is just God's gift to us, right? Like it's a sacrifice of the mass, but we're just blessed to be there, and I
Yeah,
still feel that way today. And it's been 2 years or whatever since a year and a half, I'll say. Yeah.
yeah.
So
Oh, yeah. That's great. Yeah, I still remember going up there. Like, it's so good.
this is happening.
Yeah, I know. It's like, well, all these years, like, I've been, looking for Christ, and here he is, literally, body, soul, divinity,
Yeah.
And so, how about confirmation? What was that like?
Confirmation, it was a cool set. Like I don't really I mean I remember it, but it wasn't they just so we had to go through a what is that called? I'm going blank. My wife had to go through the to get her old marriage annulled. She had been married before we got married, and so we had to wait an extra year. So we did RCIA, and then it wasn't until the next spring that we got approved to actually join the church.
Right.
And so it was a one-off ceremony with like two other people during mass.
Your confirmation?
Yeah.
Wow.
So
Wow.
It was cool, and it was neat. I love the ceremony around it, so that was really cool.
Yeah, so the bishop came and just you guys in a
Well, the bishop didn't come for that one. So like, because the priest can get
really
the priest can get the approval from the bishop to do the confirmation. So
they can. Oh, I did
yeah,
not.
yeah, the priest can be given the permission to do it. And so since it was just three or four of us,
Right.
that's our priest was given the permission to do the ceremony. So yeah, it's kind of like the same thing with exorcists, right? Like the bishop is the exorcist for your diocese. Like
Right.
that's one of their jobs, and they give that authority to a priest that is the
Yeah.
exorcist for the diocese. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, what was like the hardest part of you becoming a Catholic?
Catholic culture, it's very different. Like just your Catholic life is very different than Protestant life. The emphasis on prayer life, the emphasis on like praying the rosary every day, getting used to that.
Right.
And like it's rare I miss it now, but I mean that took me a long time to get used to stuff like that. I think there's things that and there's a video I'm probably gonna do is things we can learn from Protestants that do it better than Catholics do.
Yeah. There's definitely some things though, like reading the Bible and you
Yeah, and
know,
I think things like Bible in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz is helping Catholics
definitely.
enormously. And if you haven't listened to that, dude, just
No, I
dive in.
have. Yeah. I'm
It's
on the
great.
team.
I can't wait till they start Catechism in a Year in
I
January.
know.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think that it's just a different culture than Protestantism. So I think that was kind of different. For my wife, it's kind of interesting because we're in the South and she's a seventh generation Texan, so she's really Southern. Like my whole family's from the South too, but I grew up in California. But
Hmm.
it's she says it's very Yankee cultured. And it's just different than Southern culture with a lot of
Right.
Catholics because most people that are Catholic in the South, a lot of
Right.
them, not all, have moved down from like New York or,
Yeah.
up north and have moved down. And so it's just slightly culturally different than if you went to your Southern Methodist, Southern Baptist church. Like,
Yeah.
it's just a
Right.
different culture. And so I think that was tough for her at first. But yeah.
No, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, definitely, because like there's like a lot of Catholics who are like Italians and Irish who like moved to New York and everything during different points in history, and that's why large amounts of Catholics can be found there. But yeah, like in like the South and everything, or more rural areas in the country, like yeah, not as many. There's a lot
It's
of Protestants though, a lot of them that
Yep,
you know, yeah.
for
So
sure.
yeah, so how has like your life changed since you've become a Catholic?
God's grace showing through my life.
Yeah,
I think the things that have happened to me since becoming Catholic and putting a focus with putting Christ first and really taking my faith extremely seriously over the last 3 or 4 years has just exponentially helped with just weird things. I mean, even we moved to Greenville, South Carolina last year. Even that move was completely God. Like we wouldn't have picked here if it wasn't for God leading us here. Like it really was a divine, hey, y'all should go here type deal.
yeah,
And I think it's given me more peace than I've experienced in the past. Like all the political craziness that's going on right now in the world. Yeah, I'm concerned about it, but I have way more peace about it than I used to, where I
right,
used to be consumed by it. But at the end of the day, I'm like, man, God's in control. I'm just gonna worry about getting myself and my kids to heaven, and lead my
right,
family and do my job as a husband and father.
Yeah.
and not worry about that stuff. So
Right.
I'd say that's been the biggest impact and change that I've had.
That's good. Yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of worry in our culture, and it's not like there's no cause for it. I mean, you see, more and more encroachments for people who are, clearly on the other side when it comes to spiritual warfare, and that's definitely something to be worried about. But yeah, God is in control, and He's supposed to be ultimate priority. We can't make an idol out of politics or worrying or anything like that. So
Yep.
that's great that you find the peace in your faith. Um, so to end the interview, I'd like you to give a statement to anybody who might be on the fence about becoming a Catholic. It's like, maybe I should go, maybe I shouldn't. Like, what would you say to them?
The fullness of Christ is in the Catholic Church, and you will be the depth of your faith. I Protestantism to me, if you're looking at the difference between the two, is this deep. Where I feel like the Catholic faith is just unending. Like there's just so much there that can deepen your love for Jesus, can impact your life in just amazing ways that you find in the Catholic Church that you're not going to find elsewhere. And I think for if you're concerned about this doctrine or that, pick up the catechism, read it, listen to Scott Hahn's great. You look at like all these different guys out there that are just amazing apologetics. Listen to these guys and look at okay, they say something. Okay, now you go and do your research to whether or not they are correct or not. And, and just you go join RCIA and go through the 7 months of that. And if you still aren't convinced at the end of that, you don't have to join.
Right.
You have time, but at the end of the day, it's the right move. Like there's a lot of negative stuff you see in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But if you base it off what priests are doing or what you hear the Pope said or this or that,
Right.
that's not a good measuring stick, because Peter denied Christ 3 times, and one of his apostles was the reason he was killed on was the catalyst to get him killed on the cross. So that's not a good a good measuring stick whether you should join or not. So I'd say that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Thanks, Bryan. You can find his channel on YouTube, Quest for Faith with Bryan. The link's in the description. Thanks for coming on, Bryan.
Awesome. Hey, thank you, Colin. I appreciate it.
Thanks.